Dan Carter, a 40-year-old gym teacher, had always believed in the power of sports to change lives. On the basketball court, he wasn't just coaching. He was teaching his students to trust themselves, to push through challenges, and to find their strength. But when a simple act of kindness toward one struggling student led to his unexpected dismissal, Dan's world fell apart. Dan adjusted his whistle, glancing at the worn gymnasium clock as the echo of sneakers squeaking on the polished wooden floor filled the air. The basketball sailed across the court, landing in the hands of one of the kids who fumbled before making a hurried pass. "Eyes up, Tim. Focus," Dan called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years on this court. At 40, Dan had a presence that demanded attention, not from his physique, though he still looked the part of an athlete, but from the way he engaged with the kids. He didn't just teach drills, he instilled discipline, belief, and the idea that every shot mattered. "Coach, is this right?" a boy called, holding the ball awkwardly. "Not even close," Dan said, striding over. He bent down, adjusted the boy's grip, and said, "Control it, Danny. Like this. Now go." The boy nodded, determination replacing doubt. But behind Dan's encouraging words and steady demeanor, there was a quiet storm. The principal's earlier remark still echoed in his mind. "Dan, the budget's tight. We need results, state wins, or we might have to revisit the program." Dan knew exactly what that meant. Cutbacks, redundancies. And for a man already juggling overdue bills and sleepless nights, the pressure was suffocating. Yet he refused to show it. As the boys sprinted back and forth, their laughter mixing with shouts, Dan blew his whistle sharply. "Huddle up, team." His voice carried energy, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness he couldn't quite shake. The whistle echoed through the gym as the boys finished their last drill. Dan stood at the edge of the court, scanning the group with his sharp eyes. Most of the boys were laughing, playfully shoving each other as they gathered their things. All except for Tim. The 12-year-old hovered near the baseline, his head low, fiddling with the frayed laces of his battered sneakers. Dan frowned. He'd noticed Tim keeping to himself more often lately, avoiding the usual post-practice banter. The boy had talent, but something had shifted. Dan watched as Tim knelt down, tightening the laces on shoes that looked like they'd barely survived the last season. The soles were peeling, and a hole near the toe revealed his sock. "Tim, you okay?" Dan asked, stepping closer. Tim glanced up, startled, before nodding quickly. "Yeah, Coach, I'm fine." He stood, clutching his bag and avoiding eye contact. Dan wasn't convinced. "Hang back a minute," he said, motioning for the boy to stay as the rest of the team filtered out of the gym. Once they were alone, Dan knelt down, pointing to the sneakers. "These holding up for you?" Tim hesitated, his cheeks flushing. "They're fine," he mumbled. "Tim," Dan pressed gently, "I've been a coach for a long time. I can spot a struggling pair of shoes, and a struggling player, from a mile away. What's going on?" Tim's shoulders sagged. He looked at the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom says we can't afford new ones right now. She's trying, but things are hard. It's fine, Coach, really." Dan felt a pang in his chest. He remembered what it was like to grow up without enough, the sting of trying to hide it from everyone else. "Hey," he said softly, "thanks for telling me. Don't worry about it, all right? You're doing great out there." Tim nodded but didn't look convinced. As he shuffled out of the gym, Dan stayed behind. The image of those worn-out shoes burned into his mind. The next morning, Dan stopped by a sporting goods store on his way to work. He spent what little cash he could spare on a pair of sneakers in Tim's size. They weren't flashy, but they were sturdy and fit for the court. Before practice started that afternoon, Dan called Tim over. Holding out the shoebox, he said, "These are for you." Tim's eyes widened. "Coach, I can't—" "Yes, you can," Dan interrupted with a smile. "Every great player needs a solid pair of shoes. You deserve them, Tim. Just keep giving it your all out there." For a moment, Tim was speechless. Then he nodded, his face lighting up with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. Dan clapped him on the shoulder. "Go show the team what you've got." As Tim laced up his new shoes, the spark in his eyes returned. Watching him sprint onto the court with a renewed confidence, Dan felt a flicker of pride. For that moment, it all seemed worth it. Tim hit the court running, his movements lighter, his confidence unmistakable. The team noticed immediately. "Nice kicks, Tim," one boy shouted, tossing him the ball. Tim grinned, executing a perfect layup. "Thanks," he called back, his energy contagious. Dan watched from the sidelines, feeling a rare sense of fulfillment. Tim was thriving, and that was all that mattered. But the harmony didn't last. The next morning, Dan was halfway through setting up cones for a drill when the principal's secretary appeared in the gym doorway. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone sharp, "the principal wants to see you, now." Dan wiped his hands on his sweatpants, confused. "What's this about?" Her expression offered no clues. "He'll explain." The walk to the office felt longer than usual. When Dan stepped inside, the principal, Mr. Edwards, was seated behind his desk, his brow furrowed. Next to him sat a parent, arms crossed and a sour expression plastered on his face. "Dan," Mr. Edwards began, his voice low and clipped, "is it true you bought a student a pair of shoes?" Dan straightened. "Yes, I did. Tim needed—" "That's not the point," the parent interrupted. "You're playing favorites. How do you think that makes other kids feel?" Dan opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Edwards cut him off. "Dan, this is a serious breach of our policy. We can't allow personal gifts. It sets a precedent and creates complications." "It wasn't about favoritism," Dan said, his voice firm. "It was about helping a kid in need." "That doesn't change the rules," Edwards replied, his tone final. "I'm sorry, Dan. The board has decided to terminate your position, effective immediately." Dan froze, the words hitting him like a punch. "You're firing me for helping a student?" Edwards avoided his gaze. "You can collect your belongings today." As Dan left the office, his mind raced, but his steps were slow. The gym felt distant now, the echoes of bouncing basketballs and laughter taunting him. Dan sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills in front of him. His head throbbed, and his thoughts spun. How had everything unraveled so quickly? He ran a hand over his face, sighing heavily as the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence of his modest apartment. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Frowning, Dan stood and crossed the room. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, a young man in his late 20s stood there, dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks, a confident yet warm smile on his face. "Coach Carter," the man said, extending a hand. "It's been a while." Dan hesitated, scanning the man's face. Something about him was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Do I know you?" "It's Mike Reynolds. You coached me about 15 years ago." Dan blinked, the name stirring a vague memory. Mike Reynolds. Point guard, right? You were quick on your feet, but always second-guessing your plays. Michael laughed. "That's me. You used to tell me, 'Trust your instincts, Mike. The court's yours if you take it.'" "I've never forgotten that." Dan managed a small smile, but the weight of his current situation lingered. "It's good to see you, Mike. What brings you here?" Michael's smile faded slightly as he shifted his stance. "I heard what happened at the school. Word travels fast in this town." Dan sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, it's been a rough week." "It's not right." Michael said firmly. You did something good, Coach. You've always been about more than just teaching the game. You taught us to believe in ourselves. That's rare. Dan shrugged. Apparently that's not enough to keep a job these days. Michael's expression softened, and he glanced over his shoulder briefly as if gathering his thoughts. Then he turned back, his eyes steady. Coach, I came here because I owe you. A lot of us do. You pushed me when no one else would, and now it's my turn to return the favor. Dan frowned. What do you mean? Michael smiled again, a spark of excitement lighting his features. I run a sports training academy now. It's not just about skills. It's about building confidence in kids who might not get a chance otherwise. We've been expanding, and I need someone like you. Someone who cares. Someone who knows what it means to fight for these kids. Dan stared at him, the words taking a moment to sink in. You're offering me a job? Not just a job, Coach. A chance to do what you love without the red tape. You'd have full control over the basketball program, and the pay's decent enough to help with, well, whatever you need to take care of. Michael hesitated, then added, I'm serious. You changed my life. Let me help you change more. Dan's throat tightened. For the first time in days, hope flickered. But could he trust it? Could he really start over? I don't know what to say, he finally muttered. Michael clapped him on the shoulder. Say yes. We've got a lot of kids waiting for someone like you. Dan didn't answer right away, his thoughts a whirlwind. But for the first time, the weight on his chest seemed to lift just slightly. Dan stood at the edge of the sleek indoor court, his whistle dangling from his fingers as he took in the scene before him. The gym at Michael's academy was state-of-the-art, polished floors, rows of professional-grade equipment, and a buzz of activity as young athletes ran drills under the sharp gaze of assistant coaches. It was a far cry from the worn-out facilities he'd grown used to. Coach Carter! A voice pulled him from his thoughts. Dan turned to see a boy sprinting toward him, clutching a basketball. Can you show me that crossover move again? I keep losing control. Dan grinned. All right, let's see what you've got. The boy dribbled, attempting the move, but the ball slipped out of his grasp. Dan caught it effortlessly, spinning it on his finger before tossing it back. You're hesitating. Commit to the move. The second you doubt, the ball's gone. Trust yourself, and the court is yours. The boy nodded, determination lighting up his face. He tried again, this time pulling off the move with precision. Perfect, Dan said, clapping him on the shoulder. Now keep practicing until it feels natural. From across the gym, Michael watched, a satisfied smile on his face. He walked over, his hands in his pockets. You've got away with them, Coach, he said. They remind me of my old team, Dan replied, his tone warm but tinged with nostalgia. Michael nodded. They're lucky to have you, and from the looks of it, you're just getting started. As the day went on, Dan moved between groups of players, correcting form, offering encouragement, and demonstrating techniques with an energy he hadn't felt in years. The kids responded to him, their trust and respect growing with every drill. At the end of practice, Dan blew his whistle, gathering the group at center court. All right, listen up, he said. You've all got potential, but talent isn't enough. It's your attitude, your effort, and your belief in yourselves that'll make the difference. Now hit the showers, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. The players cheered as they dispersed, their energy infectious. Dan watched them go, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Dan leaned against the railing overlooking the court, watching the scrimmage unfold below. The players moved with precision and energy, their confidence shining in every play. Among them was Tim, now taller, leaner, and commanding the game with a quiet authority. Dan couldn't help but smile as Tim drove the ball down the court, dodging defenders with sharp cuts before sinking a clean layup. "Nice play, Tim," Dan shouted. The boy glanced up and gave him a quick nod, his focus unbroken. Behind him, Michael approached, holding a clipboard. "That kid's a star," he said. "You must be proud." Dan chuckled. "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it. He's worked for every bit of that." Michael glanced at Dan, his expression thoughtful. "He wouldn't be here without you, you know. That one small gesture you made, it set everything in motion." Dan shrugged. "It wasn't just me. Tim had it in him all along. I just gave him a push." Michael grinned. "Humble as ever, Coach. But you've made a difference here, not just for Tim, for all of them. You're building something special." Before Dan could reply, the game below came to a halt as the players gathered at midcourt. Tim jogged over, his breath visible in the cool air. "Coach," he said, his voice steady, "we're ready for the tournament. I won't let you down." Dan clapped a hand on Tim's shoulder. "You won't let yourself down, Tim. That's what matters. Now get back out there and finish strong." As Tim returned to the court, Michael tapped Dan on the arm. "Speaking of finishing strong, I've been meaning to talk to you about expanding the program. You've proven what's possible here. We've got investors interested in backing a new facility, maybe even a regional academy." Dan raised an eyebrow. "A regional academy? That's a big step." Michael nodded. "And you're the one to lead it. Think about it, Coach. This could be the start of something even bigger." Dan didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his attention back to the game, watching Tim and the others play with everything they had. For now, that was enough. The gymnasium buzzed with anticipation as players, parents, and staff filled the seats. Banners hung high, proclaiming the year's achievements, while trophies gleamed under the bright lights of the stage. Dan stood off to the side, straightening his tie and glancing at the speech he'd prepared. Public speaking had never been his forte, but tonight felt different. It was about the kids, not him. Michael stepped up behind him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Ready, Coach? They're all here because of you." Dan smirked, shaking his head. "They're here because they earned it. I just helped guide them." The announcer's voice boomed over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Coach Dan Carter to the stage." A wave of applause rolled through the room as Dan stepped forward. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd. His eyes landed briefly on Tim, sitting front and center, the latest championship medal gleaming around his neck. The sight steadied Dan, and he began. "Good evening, everyone," he started, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I'm not one for long speeches, but tonight isn't about words. It's about actions, actions that remind us what truly matters." He paused, letting the room settle. "A few months ago, I almost gave up on this, on myself, on my purpose. But then someone reminded me of the power of a small, selfless act. That's all it takes. One moment of kindness, one choice to help someone without expecting anything in return. And that act can change everything." The room was silent now, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Dan continued, his tone growing warmer. "I've seen it firsthand. A kid finding his confidence because someone believed in him. A team coming together because they refused to let each other down. Kindness, trust, and determination. They're what build champions. Not just in sports, but in life." His gaze swept the crowd, resting briefly on Tim, who was listening intently. "So here's my challenge to all of you. Be that person, the one who lifts others up, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching. Because those small acts, they come back. Maybe not right away, and maybe not in the way you expect, but they always find their way." The applause started slowly, then grew into a standing ovation. Dan stepped back from the podium, his heart full as Michael joined him on stage. "You nailed it, Coach," Michael said with a grin. Dan shrugged with a small smile. "It's not about me. It never was." As the applause continued, Dan looked out at the faces before him and felt something he hadn't in years. Absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be.